Morning, everyone. I'm Andrew Chitty. I'm the AHRC's Creative Economy Champion, which is in some ways a hilarious title. And I took it on roughly when we were starting to think about this clusters program. And so my role within the Research Council is to develop closer relationships between universities, university research, and creative industries, creative businesses. And so I've only jumped the fence, as it were, this year. So I find people referring to me as an academic and saying, what do academics think? And I go, I haven't the faintest idea. Because for the last 25 years, I've spent time as a creative practitioner and running creative businesses. But in that time, I have worked with a lot of collaborative R&D programs, research programs, and also commissioned quite a lot of research through work with the regulator. So I do think that one of the most important things that we can do as the AHRC moves forward into UK research and innovation is to have a more sustainable relationship between research that impacts on the creative industries and the creative industries themselves. And I say research that impacts on the creative industries very specifically. There's quite a few things that we will cover over this morning, and you'll think, my God, they keep repeating the same thing. Now, there's two possible interpretations for that. One is we're not very good at doing presentations and we repeat ourselves a lot, which is, I admit, possible. The other is that we're repeating things because we actually think they're really important, and there are some things that are different about what we're asking from this program than the kind of research calls that particularly the AHRC has done in the past. So one of the things we'll keep doing is re-emphasizing that difference. I'm sorry if it gets dull, and I'm sure that it will not stop us receiving lots of really interesting proposals about conventional research, but there are different things about this program. I'm just going to, before we go to our two keynotes, I just wanted to just run through what we're going to do. So we're going to have keynotes, and then we're going to Alex Vincent, the new AHRC lead for this program, and I will brief on the actual call, and then we'll do a panel session where we'll try and tease out some of the challenges that we're faced with. So hopefully that will be, both of those will be a little more interactive. I just wanted to touch a little bit on the questions that we're asking, the kind of who, what, why, and how questions. The who is pretty simple. It's you guys in the room. As we've done these briefing events, we've had some really high representation from the research sector. The who, we make no bones about. The who that are going to be winning, making successful bids to win this funding will consist of partnerships between HEIs and research groups and industry. So if we were to do these again around the second stage of the bid, we would expect a much bigger mix of creative practitioners and businesses within the room, but we have to kick this off with the research community. The what and the how, I think you'll get the impression over the course of the morning, the what and the how of this are very much emergent from the partnerships and the clusters in which they're embedded. So we're not being hugely prescriptive at this stage about the what should be the focus of these partnerships or the how they should work together. We want you to work that out with the partners, and we'll talk more about that through the morning. I just wanted to say a little bit about the why. So the context for this program, I started originally as an idea as a kind of capital program with the Treasury in the middle of last year, and Andrew Thompson and Anthony Lilly had developed that idea of focusing on clusters as an engine of economic growth prior to the industrial strategy. But where we are at the moment is that this has received funding from the industrial strategy. So the focus here is on economic growth, is on impact. So there are elements to this program that are different from normal Research Council funding. So this doesn't actually impinge on the funding that the Arts and Humanities Research Council is able to support from the research community. This is different money, and it's new money coming from the industrial strategy. As such, it definitely has strings attached because of its focus on impact and growth. So impact is not an optional extra of this program, and it isn't something that we're looking for the impact of referable research. we're looking for measurable impact on the creative economy in the clusters within which these partnerships are embedded. And I think the other thing about having that industrial strategy money is, although this is led from the Arts and Humanities Research Councils on behalf of what this new body, UKRI, it isn't restricted to the arts and humanities. So if the challenges faced in by businesses in a creative cluster require input from the behavioural sciences or the social sciences or STEAM disciplines, that's not a problem for us. So it's a question of bringing together the research disciplines that can solve the problem, not pre-formatting and assume that we have, I don't know, I'll just start offending people now deliberately rather than by accident. So it's not a question of drawing together a room of philosophers and historians because it's an AHRC project trying to work out what they can contribute to the creative industries. It's about developing challenges faced by industries within clusters, and then bringing the research disciplines and the company's own R&D capabilities together to try and solve those problems. So that's something that will thread throughout the various sessions this morning and the bid writing workshop that will follow. But I just wanted to set it out now that the nature of this is different from other AHRC programs in this area, even the knowledge exchange hubs that were previously our largest funded investment. So that's enough of me for the time being, probably at all. And what we'll now move on to is we're very pleased today that we've got two keynotes. The point of the keynotes is to try and set our way of thinking differently. So in each of these briefing events, we've tried to get keynotes from people who are outside the research community and to ask us questions of what they think we should do. So we're very pleased to have Rory Sutherland of Ogilvy UK to give our second keynote. But first, I'd like to introduce Caroline Norbury, the Chief Executive of Creative England. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure you all do know Creative England. If you don't, you should, particularly for the benefit of this call. Creative England are a really interesting public-private hybrid. So lots of people think Creative England are an agency of government. They're not. Creative England is essentially a development company for creative businesses across England. And as such have invested in companies, have developed loan schemes with companies, but the idea is to develop a network of companies across the country working with larger corporates but supporting SMEs, and been incredibly successful in that. But Caroline also plays a different role, in addition to that, in the development of the sector at the moment. She's a member of the Creative Industries Council and has been very involved, although we'll probably say almost nothing about the sector deal that's currently under negotiation. Caroline's been particularly involved in leading that work on access to finance, which is obviously an issue that challenges all creative SMEs across the country. So Caroline, I'm sure, will tell us a lot about that work, a lot about how we make the case for the creative industries, but also I hope she'll tell us, from the point of view of Creative England, what we should be doing with these partnerships. Caroline.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me. So Andrew's told you a little bit about me, and yes, I suppose I'm here wearing two hats. My hat is the Chief Executive of Creative England, and we do have an awful lot of day-to-day experience of working with lots and lots of different types of creative and digital businesses, and then also the policy work that I've been doing with government to craft the investment for growth pillar that is going to be in the sector deal for the creative industries. And it's important to know that the bit that I've been working on, which is as Andrew said, is around access to finance and investment. The people that I've been working with are, yes, they're from the industry, but also 50% of those people are actually from the investment and finance community as well. So so lots of the things I'm going to talk to you about today also come with that perspective in terms of what the investment sector wants from creative businesses, and hopefully you'll work out why that might be relevant to you. So I'm going to talk to you today about the business challenges facing creative industry businesses, what we as Creative England do to help address them, and I suppose really fundamentally how we think we might work with you guys. So, wrong way, Caroline. So let's just, I'm sure you know all of this sort of stuff, but very, very briefly, the important thing to note is that the creative industries is a real massive opportunity for the country. They turn over £87 billion worth of value for the country. They employ lots and lots of people, and they're working to a global market. So I think the last estimates in terms of the value of the content industry globally was over $2 trillion. So this is the right space to be in if actually what all of these strategies are about growing UK PLC. We're focused on the right things. And why in particular is the UK so strong? Well, we've got lots of things going for us. We've got a really good tax structure. We've got a very strong reputation when it comes to standards and codes of practice. We've got strong IP protection and legislative and regulatory frameworks. And most importantly, we've got a really, really strong pool of talent. And those businesses are not just creating jobs, but they're creating high quality, high value regional jobs. So the last stats from Tech City, which is looking at digital jobs, said that 74% of digital businesses were based outside of London. I would say there's still a challenge around creative businesses in terms of, yes, they are spread all over the country, but they are predominantly in London and the South East. And one of the things to perhaps like think about in terms of the proposals that you're crafting or the thoughts that you're putting together is how do you build on those places which do have really, really strong creative clusters and very strong digital clusters, and what are the sorts of things that you can do to help them to grow further. I think the important thing also to think about with these types of businesses is that they've got relatively low costs of entry. How do we build on that? So as you all know, another strength around the creative industries is the fact that they're not really automation proof, but we've got more chance, I think, in the creative sector of dealing with the robots than we have in lots of other types of business sectors. Predominantly, most of these businesses are international in outlook, so that's already factored into their DNA. We know that they contribute 20 million to the service export, so that's the biggest part of our export slate. And as I said, there's a rapidly expanding global market. So they're doing, if you like, they're doing all the sorts of things that we want the businesses that we want to grow in this country doing. So they're innovating, they're exporting. I don't think the formatting worked very well on my slide there. They're innovating, they're exporting, and hopefully they should also be investing both in talent, in new IP, in new products and services. So one of the things that I've been doing through the industrial strategy is another piece of research looking at the investment and finance needs for these types of businesses, and the stuff in the small font that you won't be able to read. I'll just go through with you some of the things that we've found out. So what we found out is that 80% of creative industry businesses are innovative. And that goes across 44% of SMEs generally. And 63% of them are exporting, as opposed to only 20% of SMEs generally. 56% of them had grown last year, and of that, 28% had grown by more than 20%. So that would fall into the scale-up category. And 53% of them, this is one of the most interesting things that we found out about these businesses, 53% of those businesses had leaders in them, so chief executives, managing directors, board members who had run a business before, and that compares to only 4% of businesses generally. So these are highly expert businesses who actually, a lot of the time, all they need is a bit of a helping hand with the right type of money and the right connections. What we also found out about these businesses is that they want and need advice and support, and that they're not getting it. So of those businesses that we surveyed, only 54%, only just over half of them, have a business plan. And that compares to 72% of SMEs in general. But we also found out that they want more advice and support and that they're not getting it. And that the places that they go to first and foremost are industry bodies. They don't go to professional services first. They don't go to a lot of the free advice that's provided through things like the NetLep and growth networks, they tend to go to people like the British Fashion Council, the Design Council, Creative England. So they're basically looking to connect with people who already have some practical experience of running these types of businesses. So what is Creative England doing about growing creative talent and businesses? Well, we do something that's very simple, really. So we connect businesses to the money, to the markets, and to the networks that can help those businesses grow. And we grew out of a series of regional organisations, and therefore we have people working peripatetically all across the country. So our main offices are based in Manchester and Bristol. We also have a small team based at Elstree Studio in Hertfordshire. And we also have people working in Leeds, in Sheffield, up in York, in the Midlands and so on, and in London as well. And what we do is we work creatively and commercially with small businesses who are developing new products and services. So we find those rising stars, whether they're individuals, so we work across film, TV, video games, creative, ad tech, marketing, those types of digital companies. We have some investments in fashion businesses and music businesses, but they're predominantly on the technology side rather than on the content side. And we work both with individuals, as I said, in film and in games in particular, as well as small companies. So we find those rising stars, we provide small amounts of investment, but importantly, the most important thing that we do is we connect those individuals and those businesses to other investors. We provide business advice and support, and we help to find the best people who can advise them and help them find new markets. So that could be anything from taking them to trade markets all the way through to partnerships with global brands. And many of those brands want to work with us because we make that SME engagement that they're so keen on much, much simpler. So here's a couple of examples of businesses that we've supported. So the top business, AHRC. So they're an ad tech company, and we helped them a few years ago with a very small amount. We put £50,000 in as a loan. They went to be acquired for 20 million 3 years later. Pixel Toys, which is a games company in Leamington Spa. We invested in their very first game. So they were two guys who had worked for two large gaming companies. They came together to set up their own business. That £25,000 game turned over £1 million. They've gone from employing 2 people to 50 people in the last couple of years. The Flow is a telematics company, more on the sort of, I suppose, creative software end of things rather than content. And a lot of the work that they're doing speaks to the point that Andrew made earlier around interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary opportunities. Because what they're doing is looking at finding solutions to make cities better places to live. So that's just a quick sort of sample of some of the businesses that we've worked with and the impact that the investment that we've put in has had on them. I also want to mention CE50, which is our annual look at the most creative companies around the country. So we've been running that for we're in our 4th year now. And many businesses that have been featured in our CE50 are now using that as almost like a badge of honour to help them when it comes to securing further investment or to open particular doors for them. So far we've been going for just about 6 years now, but we've only been investing probably for about 4 of those years. And in that time, we've invested in 358 businesses. And the figures that we did a sort of a sense check about 6 months ago, looking at one particular slate of investment that we'd made. And what we found was that our tiny sums of money had grown the average profit by 150% of the companies that had been on the programs with us. We also work with individual creative talent. And we're getting, as well as getting commercial success, we've got real creative success as well. So we have a program called iFeatures, which works with first-time film and filmmakers, writers, directors, and it's a partnership with the BFI, with BBC Films, and we also have a commercial investor working alongside us. We're now on our 4th slate of iFeatures, and these were all from the last slate and the slate behind that. But just looking at adult life skills, went on to win the Nora Ephron Prize at Tribeca last year. God's Own Country has just finished in the cinemas. Actually, I think it still might be playing. I'm pretty sure that's going to get some BAFTA nominations. Lady Macbeth opened earlier this year. So all of those films are actually commercially they're doing quite well, but creatively and artistically, they're winning awards. They're all screening at first-tier international film festivals. As well as working with individuals, as I said, we also work with creative people within companies. And Games Lab is one of the programs that we run for video games companies. And we've taken this product. So it's basically a program designed to address the problems that small developers and small games companies face in growing their business. So sometimes we invest in the games, but quite often we're also investing in the company and the infrastructure around that company. And we found that it works really well geographically. So that we create a peer-to-peer network, a cohort within the city region that we're working in. So we've run Games Lab in Bristol in the southwest, in the West Midlands, and now we're running it in Leeds. And I can see that Anthony's here. And Anthony set up the very first Games Lab that we ran in Bristol. So the one in Leeds, the reason for putting this on the slide, A, it's current, and B, this is probably the first iteration of Games Lab where we've worked very, very closely with universities. So we're working with several universities in the Leeds city region. And then the other thing that we do is we connect all of those SMEs to big brands, and as we call it, our Big Guy, Little Guy program. So one of the things that we realized when we started investing in lots of these companies is that quite often the missing bit for them was that connection to the market opportunity. And quite often the market opportunity is not necessarily, the consumer, it's actually to another, if you like, another sort of step on the way. So it's working with those large brands. So one of the programs that we've run, which has been particularly successful for games companies, is a partnership that we have with Microsoft, where we invest in a slate of companies every year that Microsoft are also interested in. They make available a whole ream of stuff to those companies. We put a small bit of money in. But then those games, A, they get all the sales and marketing and obviously the gaming expertise of Microsoft, but they also get they actually get access to a platform that's going to connect them to an audience. And so we utilize the network that we've got with those small companies to then attract the bigger businesses that are looking for innovation, experimentation. They're looking for new IP, and they're looking to do it as cost effectively, but also, frankly, as emotionally easy as possible. And what lots of brands say is that working with small businesses is a bit of a nightmare. But equally, doing innovation within those big companies is also a bit of a nightmare. So we think that we've created really quite a sweet spot where we take away an awful lot of the pain that those brands have in finding those companies and make it easy for the SMEs also to connect to those companies. So I've mentioned CE50. I don't need to talk about that anymore, I don't think. So, in a nutshell, Andrew said to me, Caroline, please come over and have a chat and talk to the audience around the sorts of things that you think this Creative Cluster programme ought to do. And I've had several meetings with Andrew Chitty and with Andrew Thompson, looking at, in the early days, what the opportunities were for universities in this space. And I think that based on the experience that we have in terms of working with both creative talent individually, but also creative SMEs, I think it's really, really important to be very focused around what the whole point of all of this is. So the whole point of this is because it is an initiative within the industrial strategy. And the point of the industrial strategy is to create wealth and prosperity and to make that more inclusive. Okay, so And what we're doing as a country is we're really struggling with many of the levers that we've pulled and pushed upon in the past. And so we've got to stop doing the same things over and over again. And that's important for everybody. That's important for brands. That's important for you as universities. That's important for government departments. We have to find new partnerships. We have to find new ways of doing stuff. And I think we have to keep in mind what is mission critical. And what is mission critical with this programme is to create jobs. Okay, and to grow businesses and to add to the wealth of our country. So I think that what the Creative Cluster Partnerships ought to be doing is they should be removing those barriers to collaboration in order to help industry grow. So we should be enabling academics to work with businesses to identify those research challenges and issues, and that should be a two-way conversation. Shouldn't just be necessarily around, well, I mean, it might be around your particular expertise, but the point of this is actually to address some challenge also that industry is facing. So it needs to identify those research challenges and to do so in a way that is collaborative. It needs to provide a real-world business environment for that R&D, and it needs to link those ideas, those products and services to the market opportunity. There's no point in doing it in a vacuum. They have to be linked to an outcome. And importantly, it really needs to keep the endpoint in mind, which is definitely about making new stuff, because so many of the technologies, the products and services that are in the creative industries are based on an idea rather than a business model. So it's really, really important that we continue to challenge in terms of the content that we're making, because I truly believe that actually that drives technology as much as technology driving content. But importantly, we need to create jobs and prosperity. So we know that you guys in the audience have access to the research and development talent, the methods, the ideas, the resources. We at Creative England, and through many of our partnerships, and many of those partnerships are outwith of the screen industries as well, so we work with a lot of different partners. We've got very, very strong relationships with those businesses and with those global brands. And we really do believe that this is an opportunity to have a really meaningful partnership and make a difference to the creative sector and to the businesses that are in them, not only through their research and development, but by helping them to realise their commercial potential as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Caroline. I think a very interesting way that Caroline's framed that up. Oh, thanks for the clicker. Which is what is mission critical to this proposition, and that idea of industry and university researchers working together to identify challenges that can then be addressed by R&D really is mission critical for us, and indeed improving the interplay between creative businesses, who are difficult to work with, but then so are universities, if you've ever worked outside them, is also really critical. For our second keynote, I suppose there's the other question about this is, what is creative research? And Rory Sutherland, I would say, almost needs no introduction as one of the UK's most highly respected advertising creatives. He's currently Executive Creative Director of Ogilvy and a past president of the IPA. But it's perhaps through Rory's TED Talks and his fortnightly Spectator column that he's reached out to a wider audience to think about what it is, not just the lessons from a professional career in advertising, but also thinking about those kind of research disciplines which might be brought to bear on the creative industries, and particularly advertising, whether it be evolutionary psychology or behavioural economics. Thinking about where we might want to go in creative research and what impact that might have on our practice going forward. So hopefully to tell us how those things apply and what he would like from these R&D partnerships, Rory Sutherland.
The fascinating thing to me about this is how well it illustrates, first of all, the importance of naming things. In that 10 years ago, 12 years ago, effectively the creative industries didn't exist. By which I mean the industries existed, but the idea that there was any commonality between someone working in advertising and someone working as an architect or as a games designer, the idea that we had any more in common, for example, or anything more to connect us than with someone in, I don't know, law or whatever, probably hadn't occurred to most of us, and consequently, we had no idea what contribution we made to the economy, because we looked at our own individual part of the creative industries, and it was typically a sort of 1 or 2% thing, and therefore our influence with government was pretty negligible. Our ability to make the case for what we did was fairly weak. So part of my talk, by the way, is going to be simply about the importance of naming things. But I'm going to make another point, which is what I discovered recently is that there is a science to a creative industry. It's a different kind of science. And let me just explain what's going on here. Essentially, there are two ways of creating value. Okay? You can either create value by changing objective reality, or you can create value by changing subjective perception. Okay? Now, most industries are in the business of actually creating or changing physical stuff. An architect or an advertising person or a games designer mostly, interestingly, works through a different kind of innovation. I sometimes call it innovation, spelt I-N-N-E-R, which is actually creating value mostly in the head by getting us to look at something differently. I had a beautifully simple and perfectly pertinent example of real innovation. Only about 6 months ago, when I landed at Gatwick Airport on an EasyJet plane. And you know that business when you land at an airport and you're about sort of half a mile from the airport terminal and you park up on a little bit of concrete apron and you hear the engines wind down and everybody on the plane simultaneously thinks the same thought, which is, oh shit, it's going to be a bus. You know, you're cheated of your air bridge, and now, you know, having paid for this ticket, I'm going to be bussed to the terminal. And fantastically, the pilot was accidentally a creative genius. He said something I'd never heard before and which had never occurred to me before. He said, I've got some bad news and some good news, which, by the way, is a very good psychological hack in itself. The human brain likes to minimize regret, and therefore, if you give people some bad news and some good news, the brain will automatically concentrate on the good news simply to effectively make the best of the situation. Very important psychological finding, by the way, which is that putting people in any position where there's no upside, you know, what you might call, you know, a parking ticket, okay, is disproportionately frustrating and unpleasant. And I've argued variously to people like AHRC that one of the things you could do as a great psychological hack is you could change the way tax is paid, so that when you pay more tax, you get a small, trivial upside benefit. E.g., the more tax you pay in your working life, you're given a slightly higher tax allowance in retirement, for example. Because just having a very, very small amount of upside completely changes the way a human processes things. I mean, there are people who've been to jail for 6 years who can present it as a positive experience. They can say, you know, it was, you know, a great learning experience. I met people I would never otherwise have met. Okay. It's almost easier to do that with a jail sentence than with a parking ticket or with a tax bill, ironically. So what the pilot said, he said, I've got some bad news and I've got some good news. He said, the bad news is there's a plane blocking our gate, so we won't be able to get you an air bridge. But the good news is that the bus will take you all the way to passport control, so you won't have far to walk with your bags. And I looked at my companion, I said, hold on, that's always true, isn't it? But nobody ever told us. Actually, I've got quite a heavy bag, I'm glad there's a bus. And what they'd done magically is they'd synthesized happiness and value from the bus experience in a way, and the great thing about innovation as opposed to innovation, in a way which, when you think about it, is completely environmentally friendly. The business of actually creating perceived value is much, much less carbon intensive than creating physical value. If you can get people to value more highly things they already have, that's a great form of economic progress. Now, this is where I think it gets difficult, why partnerships with academia are interesting and difficult. Okay. It's this. Most of science has achieved its progress by completely ignoring the quirks of human perception and focusing entirely on objective reality. And by the way, in large parts of science, in astrophysics, in cosmology, in engineering, that's exactly what I want them to do. No one would ever get on an aircraft if it were designed subjectively by an aesthete, okay? Right? Most of science, therefore, sees its aim as creating units of absolute, numerical clarity, whether it be units of temperature, units of distance, units of time, which are completely freed from any subjective bias or distortion. Okay? And quite a lot of those sciences, the sciences involved in innovation, should be doing exactly that. But I would argue the problem that's often happened with the social sciences, particularly government policy making and economics, is that because they see that kind of complete obsession with objectivity as the hallmark of a science, they've applied the same approach to human sciences, including, for example, economics. I would go even further and say medicine. Now, a really interesting question. If you're in the creative industries and you want to criticize medics, there's a really interesting question you can ask. This is about innovation, if you like, innovation. Okay? Why are you guys so down on the placebo effect? Because the placebo effect is probably the most important and beneficial, known and absolutely reliable thing in all medicine, because it works against pretty much all conditions. You'd think there would be a huge amount of research among people trying to boost it and magnify it. But instead, they go, we don't like that because it's messy. If you actually cure someone through the placebo effect, it's cheating. What we want is objective medicine. I'd take completely the opposite view. I'd say if homeopathy doesn't work at all objectively, but it hacks people into thinking that maybe they're going to get better, and so their immune system then gears up a little bit extra and they do get better, my view is what's not to like? And that's a really interesting unifying force for the creative industries. That one of the things we have to fight for is the second kind of science. And we've got to stop the second kind of science trying to model itself on the first kind of science. Okay? The first kind of science is obsessed with basically, now, don't get me wrong, you couldn't have done the Cassini project if you hadn't had some pretty good models of gravity and distance and time and so forth. Not dissing it in that. What I do diss is the misapplication, what's sometimes called physics envy, of kind of objective, species-independent measures of things that are completely non-subjective to fields of scientific inquiry which should be dominated by the understanding of exactly what makes us human. This is where I think behavioural economics and Richard Thaler's Nobel Prize for Economics is such an important thing. Because economics was effectively trying to be biology-free. It was effectively trying to create a kind of physics model of how people should act and behave and exchange that was modelled on Newtonian physics. But that's an absurd thing to do once you accept that human perception and all its quirks and inherited evolutionary oddities, human perception does not present us at all with an objective depiction of reality. It's a very simple thing, by the way. Do you know that your television is species-specific? It's obviously a fascinating thought, okay? If you had a dog, you could actually, because humans are mostly, I think, trichromats. So you have 3 colors only, red, green, blue, in your TV, okay? When your TV screen is completely blue, completely red, or completely green, it's actually telling the truth. It is green, and it looks green to you. Most of the rest of the time, yellow on TV, total big fat lie. It's a hack created by a mixture of red and green, which, because we only have 3 types of cones in the back of our retina, okay? The way the brain perceives pictures and colors is by seeing the relative strength of stimulus that's hitting those 3 different kinds of cone with a different sensitivity of the spectrum. And from those 3 little data points, it constructs the complete spectrum of color. Okay? If you had a dog, you could make a TV for your dog with only 2 colors. They're mostly red-green colorblind, so you just need blue and kind of red or something. Meanwhile, an insect or a parrot would look at your television and it would go, how come humans are prepared to put up with this totally shit picture? because they have 4 cones. So the whole design of a television, your TV, it doesn't actually say when you buy a TV, optimized for humans. But that's exactly what it is. It isn't actually real, it's just designed to look real for us. I would argue that all the human sciences have to abandon this idea of being objective and realize that actually we've got to be species specific here. We've actually got to understand what it is that people have evolved to care about, understand that better and better, and then we can solve the problems through perceptual change rather than reality change. Now, I know, it's always associated, I come from the advertising industry, it's always associated with cheating. My view is you can cheat using that, but actually your brain is distorting reality to you all the time in any case. And the most important thing, really important evolutionary discovery is evolution. We've always assumed that evolution has given us perceptual mechanisms of the world that give us a more and more accurate depiction of reality. And when they model this, they realize that, of course, evolution doesn't give a damn about accuracy, it only cares about fitness. So if there's a fitness advantage to misrepresenting the world, that's what we get. We don't get reality. And I think the potential for R&D in terms of human perception, and behavioral economics is part of it. That, I think, provides the what. I think evolutionary psychology provides the why. I mean, those are my 2 very heavy interests myself. I'm totally happy to listen to others. I'm patently clear that, you know, social geography and other social sciences have, social psychology in general, have a huge role to play. But the potential to experiment with not what is objectively good, but what is subjectively okay, strikes me as having much more potential for real advances than physics. By which I mean, I think it's going to be a lot easier in the next 10 or 15 years to make a train journey 10 times more enjoyable than it is to make it 10 times faster. You know, Hyperloop or not, you know, that's a perfectly serious question to ask, by the way. You know, the obsession with speed, arguably, if people sit on a train staring into space, the best way you can improve a train journey might be to make it faster. I would argue that's the obsession with the objective measure, which is duration and speed, triumphing, as they usually do, because of this false physics envy in the sciences, triumphing over the subjective measure, which is, was the journey enjoyable, pleasant, and useful? And I'll let you into a secret. When I'm invited to give talks, if my PA ever says, I said to my PA, where is it? And if she ever says, it's noon in Manchester, okay? I say, I don't care what it is, I'll go. And she said, what on earth are you talking about? Why would you just go to Manchester at random? I said, it's 4 hours on a train there and back. Most productive 4 hours I'll have in the whole week. So the idea that you have to reduce that time to improve some objective measure. And I think the creative industries can fight together to make this point, that actually, economically, environmentally, we're running out of stuff to burn and stuff to build. What we need to do is actually learn to appreciate better the things we already have and learn to design them around human psychology rather than around a sort of economics, physics, or engineering model. People aren't freight, and yet nearly all models of transport effectively don't really distinguish between the efficient transportation of a container and the efficient transportation of a human being. That's how kind of biology-free a lot of this stuff has become. We've got to bring it back. But I'll end with another plea, which is just the importance of naming things. As I said at the beginning, the creative industries didn't exist about 12 years ago. That wasn't because they didn't exist, it's because nobody had named them. And naming things is really, really important, I think, in 2 areas. One of which is there are many cases where there would be, what's the value? I'll give you a perfect example. What's the value of the name Silicon Valley? You know, it's worth billions. I don't know how many billions. It's not easy to quantify. It's worth billions. They were also clever enough, by the way, when they defined Silicon Valley, to define an area that was so amorphous and unclearly defined that, depending on how you choose to define it, it can actually include about 4 million people. It includes southern San Francisco. When Londoners named it Silicon Roundabout, they didn't have quite the same geographical ambition, did they? Okay? Now, what things are called and whether we can influence what they're called is extraordinarily important. Generally, it doesn't happen as much as it should, simply because unless you're a very big real estate developer, Belgravia, for example, was named by the developer. There were huge plans, I think, to call Bayswater Paddingtonia and so forth. And if there was a very, very large real estate owner who was developing property, they saw the value of naming a development. Sometimes you have to name something actually preemptively. Which is why the gherkin was so named. They called it the gherkin because they had a sudden panic that if they didn't call it the gherkin, Londoners were going to call it something far worse. Okay, so it was a preemptive strike in calling the thing the gherkin. But the interesting thing about names is they do two things. They create commonality, just like the creative industries. They create a sense of commonality and tribal identity where none existed before. And that's extraordinarily valuable. But they do something a bit more as well. They also, I think, make it possible to do things that you couldn't otherwise do before. Now, I'll give you a few very great examples of creative naming of things, funnily enough, from an academic and advertising partnership. Early days, and I talked about the fact that you can use these skills for evil, BO was invented by the advertising industry because if you made people anxious about it, they'd buy more antiperspirants and deodorants. Athlete's foot was invented by the advertising industry. They invent the name, they invent the condition, then they sell the cure. But there's a far more benign application of exactly the same trick, which is designated driver was invented by the group of behavioral scientists at Harvard and a group of campaigners, I think in Canada. What they did is they invented the phrase designated driver. If you're Flemish or Dutch or Belgian, there's an equivalent which is Bob, which is a kind of backronym, which is deliberately sober driver. And they'll say, who wants to be Bob this evening? And they did a whole advertising campaign about Bob. In the US, they took the phrase designated driver and they went to Hollywood and they embedded it into the scripts of soap operas and the scripts of sitcoms. So that people thought it was a thing. Because you create a name, you create a norm. And they just created the thing, designated driver. Suddenly, it became an absolutely established social norm that when you went out on the lash with 3 of your friends, one of you stayed sober. Secondly, the sober guy no longer felt like a complete loser. He wasn't the sad oath standing there with a Diet Coke. He could actually explain, no, actually, I'm the designated driver. And he could look a bit of an altruist and a bit of a mensch. And it took a thing, it created a norm for it. Now, the ability, I think, for naming geographical clusters, for example, to create norms where none existed before. I'm very excited about the idea of creating the creative coast. I think creative people are much more ready to move to the seaside than to the countryside. I don't know why it is. Seaside towns tend to be tolerant. But stretching all the way from sort of Brighton through Hastings, all the way around East Kent, including East Anglia, there's a whole swathe of pretty desirable, not always insanely expensive real estate from which you can travel into London for the day. Okay? Now, I think if you name that the creative coast, naming the corridor, for example, that goes Cambridge, Milton Keynes, there's going to be a new rail corridor, isn't there? Goes Cambridge, Milton Keynes, and Oxford. Now, that's going to be a huge opportunity for creative branding. As I said, it connects, 2 of Britain's intellectual powerhouses with the attractive coastal town of Oxford. And just pause for a second there. The interesting thing there is what you call things has an ability to create a complete identity, commonality, and common action, and collaborative action where none existed before. And the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that if you name things, the name itself can create the behavior and can create the identity, I think is really, really important. As I said, real estate developers have known how to do it, North Kensington probably being the most ambitious use of creative branding of an area. We can do it of ourselves, and we can also do it of the places we work, so that people actually fundamentally consider them differently. And what those things do sometimes is they give permission. And I'm always very keen, I think that downsizing or empty nesting are useful coinages. Because previously, if someone in later life decided to move to a smaller house, it was perceived as being a necessity, not a choice. The great thing about we've decided to downsize is that it actually portrays it as a choice, not a necessity. You can change the way people look at things by renaming them, and you can change the perception of the behavior, and therefore you can actually encourage the behavior. It's kind of like magic. And I think the possibility for this, for us uniting and actually understanding that we should deploy our own skills in creating psychological value, both around places and around our identity, I think is really important. Because the fascinating thing, as I said, is the creative industries might as well not, they did exist 12 years ago, but they might as well not have done. It took a name first. Thanks very much indeed. Which way do I go?
So wow, how many ideas were there in that? I have a new rule in life, never follow Rory Sutherland onto a podium, and I'm not going to stand for very long between you and coffee where you can discuss those ideas. But there's I just want to draw out a couple of things there. I mean, I think Rory has hit on the head one of the problems that we are and will continue to grapple with in this program, which is, in the context of the industrial strategy, is the nature of creative R&D and its relationships to models from engineering and medicine that are applied in government policy. So that's a real kind of live big issue for us. I think also Rory's put on the table a very provocative research agenda for the creative industries, and even named a location where you could apply it. So I don't know if anybody wants to pick up that agenda or that location challenge, but taking the behavioural and social sciences, working with the UK's fantastic advertising sector, would seem to me a kind of huge offer if people are interested in it. And the question then is, would that fit within the boundaries of this competition? So that's what we're going to find out after the break. I think it's fairly obvious. The answer might be, yeah, maybe. So we'll meet back here for after coffee in 20 minutes, and Alex and I will brief you on the programme. Thanks. Right, welcome back. So now we're going to move into the briefing session, and this is the bit about what is it about the £50 million that brings you here this morning. So I'll talk a little bit about, there's two parts to this. One is about clusters and what we mean around clusters, and one is what it says in the call documentation. So I'll take the first bit, the easy hand-waving bit, and then Alex Vincent will come on stage with the hardcore technical bit, and then we'll do some Q&A. So, creative clusters. So what we've established right from the start is the context for this programme is the industrial strategy, and specifically the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. So obviously the industrial strategy, the aim to have a strategic approach to supporting key sectors of the UK economy, and then the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, which is X billion, 4.8 was the number that was originally announced, of new money to support R&D in those key sectors. And I think it's not bonkers to think of this in the context of Brexit. So in terms of funding R&D in key sectors for an economy that could encounter a rough ride over the next few years. So the interesting thing about the Strategy Fund is that whereas within the creative industries, the sector deal has gained probably most attention, and particularly with the Bazalgette review 3 weeks ago, the launch of Baz's review, the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund has perhaps not been so prominent, but it is where all the new money is. So the first few investments from that were announced before the summer, and they were in what you might think of as very traditional R&D intensive sectors. So there's a thing called the Faraday Challenge, which is about the development of new battery technology for the automotive sector. So that's an interesting one. It's really what's the problem the automotive sector has, and you could think of it as what is the thing that's going to anchor the automotive sector in the UK with the development of electronic vehicles post-Brexit. There were other early announcements in remotely piloted and autonomous vehicles in dangerous situations, for which I kind of tend to read the oil and gas industry and exploration. And there were also a significant investment was announced. this work better up there than I'm down here. There's a significant investment announced in the pharma sector, so a large investment in the support of new drug discovery technologies with the aim of them reaching market. So these are key kind of traditional R&D intensive sectors. Rory raised the issue earlier on of the definition of R&D derived from those kind of engineering, medicine, technology sectors being applied to the creative sector. And to be honest, it's not so much it being applied to the creative sector as that in those initial announcements there being nothing for the creative industries at all. So I think one of the findings that we've had, certainly I've had since crossing the fence, is that whilst you rarely meet somebody in Whitehall that would argue that the creative industries are fluffy and not an important economic sector, so that's a kind of victory won over the last decade. The idea that as a consequence of that, our sector and our industries need R&D, public R&D support in the way that is perfectly natural or easy to understand, apparently, in policy circles for medicine, for engineering, for automotive. That argument isn't one. So what we've really been doing over the last 6 months is making a case for R&D investment in the creative sector. So one of the underlying things that we have is, this is the announcement of this programme, the £50 million of new funding, new cash funding coming into this programme, is the first time that creative R&D has been seen in policy circles on the same level as in those other sectors. So in the words of John McVeigh, who opened up our first one of these briefing sessions, it's very important we don't cock it up. And that does underpin some of our thinking. So 3 weeks ago, is that 3 weeks? It seems so much longer. Greg, at the announcement, when Baz launched his independent review of the creative industries, which obviously precedes the sector deal, Greg Clark and Karen Bladley both stood up, and Greg announced this programme. Now, fortunately, we haven't made it all up in the last 3 weeks, which would have been rather trying. We'd been working on it before. But so Greg announced the 80 million. We can go into how 50 equals 80, but I'm sure you've got the imagination to understand that. The 80 million Creative Industries Clusters programme would be a boost to our creative industries and help prosperity and growth. And so the context for that's worth mentioning is it was framed within that launch that this programme is a pilot for the much wider clusters intervention that Baz recommended. So Baz thinks there should be a £500 million fund to support the development of clusters all across the piece. So company business growth support, support for clusters of different sizes, support for the evolution of clusters. So much more all-embracing idea that perhaps we'll talk about a little with our distinguished panel later, the difference between the two. But what this programme is from our point of view, is not an all-embracing clusters programme in pilot. It's asking the question, what can be achieved by an investment in R&D within clusters? So it's not so much a pilot as a part of the issue. So we've all become used to the idea, and these slides are old and not nearly as snazzy as Caroline's, but basically tell the same story that we've become used to telling, which is the creative industries are one of the fastest growing sectors of the UK economy, and particularly in terms of employment, and also in terms of exports. But the question is, where can we make an investment in the creative industries, in R&D, that's going to have an impact across the UK? And so you'll already be familiar with this because it was on one of Caroline's slides. So the geography of creativity in the UK. So the idea that creative businesses grow most successfully when they're clustered together. So it's both an observation and a kind of guide to policy. So it is the case that those areas where creative businesses cluster, they grow better, but what can we do with that as policy? And there's obviously a lot of the data here relies on the work that Hassan Bakshi and Juan Mateo Garcia have been doing at Nesta. Probably now it's probably 10 years since they produced their first kind of clusters report, at which point they identified 9 clusters. There's also other sectors are interested in the impact of clustering. So TechNation is looking at clustering as well, so within the digital technology sector, and obviously there's an overlap between the two. But perhaps the most familiar piece of data was this from the Geography of Creativity, where Nesta identified 47 clusters. So it's gone up from 9, 10 years ago, to 47 clusters. As we've been going around the country, we always get shout-outs at this point when we were in Manchester and the Northwest on Friday doing one of these briefings, and whoa, several creative clusters up there. Previous week we've been in Birmingham. Birmingham, as you'll notice, there is an anomaly within the Nesta data that Birmingham, which has a very strong creative economy, as everybody in Birmingham will tell you, doesn't actually appear in the data. So one of the things we wanted to do was, when you're thinking about putting together a bid and a partnership, is reference the data on creative clusters. So one of the things that we're asking you to do in your phase 1 bids, don't worry so much about the expressions of interest, but the phase 1 bids, is it's a key part of the proposition that the HEI, who is filling in the form and leading on behalf of the partnership, convinces us that they know and are connected into that cluster of businesses. So one of the things we'd like you to do is reflect on what the data shows us. But at this level, this is the whole of the creative industry. So I'll come on to the fact that we've asked Nesta to give us some data that's a little bit more granular that you can play with as well. So just in terms of what a creative cluster is, I think we're all reasonably happy with the Nesta definition. So there's just pull out 3 bullet points here. A geographic concentration of creative businesses and workers. Okay, that's fine. There's an interesting point there. It's not just businesses, it's workforce. So an important part of clusters is the ability to develop a workforce that can move and develop their careers across companies. But they don't just live in the same place. They are engaged in economic activity with each other. So they're in value chains or even supply chains, and they collaborate and compete with one another. So the thing about a cluster is it's not just a bunch of businesses that happen to be pinned to the same geography. It's the relationships between them. So within clusters, there are other institutions that link to a value chain, and particularly important for our purposes, HEIs. But don't forget the other important enabling or supportive institutions that are there. The cultural institutions, the trade associations, the organisations like Creative England that network with businesses. And also, it's a key part for us that this aligns with the other economic actors within the cluster. So government bodies, local government, the combined authorities are playing an increasingly important part of this if you're outside London, and the national economic development agencies for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So what we're trying to do is make sure that you don't just articulate businesses, but that you align with the other stakeholders so that if the LEP has a strategic plan that your R&D thing sits alongside, then we'd look to leverage those links. The other thing that Nesta point out, and this can be something I'm sure there'll be questions on, is this idea that creative clusters come in different sizes and configurations. So that is true. As Alex I'm sure will go on to say, we have decided that this program is to support R&D partnerships within established clusters because we think that's our best chance of achieving success and making this not a one-off but becoming a fixture of the landscape. But the other thing about clusters is they are differently architected, and perhaps something we'll come on to talk about in the panel is there's other organisations that play pivotal roles in clusters working, whether they be hubs or incubators, whether they're neutral spaces that bring people together, and that's an important feature we think. So, as I said earlier, the Nesta data is great, and it's all done in travel to work areas, and it's a really fabulous piece of work. Nesta are going to bring out a new report later in the year called Creative Nation. But what we wanted to do was to help people develop their bids, was to release something that's a little more granular, because it occurred to us that if you aggregate all of the diverse DCMS definitions of the creative industries on one map, this is what you get. So you get a very heavy concentration in the southeast, and you pull out some metro areas, so Yorkshire, the northwest, Bristol, Central Belt and Scotland. Now, some of the subsectors, because we're imagining that some people might, in their approach to clusters, take a subsectoral approach. They may not try and represent all the businesses in their cluster, or they might only want to represent ones that are strong in their cluster. So some subsectors, like film and TV, the audiovisual industry, basically the map looks pretty similar to the overall distribution. But some don't. So if you look at architecture, it's much more widely spread across the UK. Something going on down there in the southwest in terms of employment. Maybe it's just the changing and diffuse nature of architecture that you can go and live in Dartmoor. But there are strengths that are differently clustered. And I'll make no bones about it. One of the reasons that we wanted to do this is so that there's two reasons. One is help you. Of course, we're trying to help you. So we give you some data. We'll release this stuff hopefully by the end of this week as data that you can play with. So one is to help you prepare your bids and say, we are strong in this, look at the data. The other is to help us. So if you say, we have a world-class cluster in this, we would like to have a baseline to try and evaluate whether that might or might not be the case. And one of the things I think when you're thinking about geography is the geography of clusters being defined by where the businesses are may be different from being defined by where the excellence in research is. So some patterns, as I say, look different. So the craft sector, I always have to say this, 3 times as big as the UK recorded music industry. Is there anybody from the music industry in the room? But it is, and that's by the music industry's figures, not by the Crafts Council. Crafts looks different. The geography is very different. The periphery and Wales comes into play. Museums, galleries and libraries, perhaps surprisingly when you cut it out of the data. In employment terms, the South East focus almost disappears. That's quite a surprise that some of these sectors, and you might think of this as a cultural sector, but some of those key institutions, though cultural, and when we say creative industries, we mean the cultural industries embedded within that because we've spent enough time in the Department for Business to know that that's the best strategy. Those key cultural organisations can act as test beds, as aggregators for SME activity, and as very, very important partners in their own right. So we'll release the data by the end of the week. Please use it. Don't worry about it for the expression of interest, but please use it in your bids. If you find what you want to say completely contradicts the data, please explain it. Don't think of it as a problem, just explain it. So when Baz identified this focus on clusters as a way forward in his review, he pulled out kind of three reasons why this is the case, why this is going to be impactful. So one is providing a stimulus to regional growth. Now, this is a London briefing. There are people here from way outside the M25 region, but we have to acknowledge that there is a place-based aspect to this. And so providing a stimulus to regional growth and a rebalance in the economy is the general framework within which this is operating. Baz also identified that the objective is by funding clusters, one can achieve the impact of improving productivity. And there's 2 elements to that, through increasing density of the number of businesses within a cluster, or by growing and scaling businesses in the cluster. So either pull more businesses in, start up more businesses, or scale businesses. But it's perhaps the third one that's really, from this context, that's the most important for us. So the idea of developing a tailored talent and R&D pipeline for local areas by forging stronger links between education and industry. So that's really, for our point of view, that's the thing that we would pull out of Baz. That's not, as I say, it's not that this program is a pilot for Baz, but it's within the context of a growing interest in clusters. So I'm going to hand over at that point to Alex Vincent, who's going to tell you what you have to do.
Right. Okay, and that is where I hope I can get the technology to work. This is only my day 5 in this role as well, so go easy on me. I have come from Research Councils UK, though, and I was the cross-council lead on the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, so I have got a bit of background in this. But if I miss anything, it's just as well we've got a question and answer panel. So if there's something I don't focus on, then let me know afterwards, and we can cover it in questions. You'll also notice, and it is designed to be like this, I will say a lot of the same things that Andrew has already said. We are trying to hammer home some of these points, so please do listen and pick up on those points. Now, hopefully you're all much more au fait with this because you've read your call documents, you know what the aims and objectives of the programme actually are. So as Andrew has said, and as we've heard from keynote speakers as well, the importance of growing the creative industries through exciting new products, services and experiences. Now, this is different money, and there are different strings attached on this. And I know that Andrew said way up front, right in the introductory comments, this is about economic impact. And we make no apologies for that. This is different funding. So we do need to know that the creative clusters that are funded are actually going to do that work, so have an impact, develop new products and services and experiences. And, you know, that is about creating the R&D infrastructure. Some of those earlier challenges that were announced before the summer are probably more traditionally based around growing some of that infrastructure. So in the medical sciences, life sciences, you see the big capital investments. This is a bit different, perhaps, and you know, call me out on it, tell me I'm wrong, but for the creative industries to have this kind of investment. There's the 51 million figure, which is, I'm sure, focusing everybody's minds in the room. What we're really here to brief on today is the 8 creative R&D partnerships. There is also within this programme the Policy and Evidence Centre, but that will be part of a separate process, so don't focus your applications on that, that's separate. What we're looking at here are the 8 R&D partnerships. And these are going to be based around a challenge. Now, these are just some of the identified challenges that we know that the sector has, but really it is down to your bid to really identify what challenge is it going to be that you're going to pick off. We're not specifying what you should look at. That's where the innovation comes from, we would hope. So again, back to this. What is this all about? It is about growing creative industries. And I've gone backwards, haven't I? Let's go the right way. Otherwise, it really will get repetitive. No, I did go the right way. It is just that we're repeating it. There we go. Confusing me. So yes, it is about making sure that we are growing the creative industries. These are the key aims. And again, you'll see here what Andrew was saying. It is about investing and enhancing these existing creative clusters. This isn't about trying to develop a new regional cluster in a particular area. We are looking to invest in what is already there and make sure that it is really about growth for the UK. It is about collaboration. So it is about the HEIs and industry working together in proper meaningful collaborations and partnerships. And again, just to emphasise that this call is about the R&D partnerships, and the Policy and Evidence Centre is an integral part, but part of a different process. So the R&D partnerships, what might you think might be some of the key features? So we're going to labour the point. It is about existing creative clusters and investing in those. Challenge-led, and this is the real difference about the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund as well. We are looking to make sure that there is a real challenge, something you're actually going to help to solve, either in its entirety or partway to. That challenge needs to be at the real centre of your bid. It will be hosted by an HEI, but actually they're the ones filling in the application and submitting it. What is much more important is the strength of the partnership. So who are you bringing together, both from academia, but also industry? Andrew said it as well, those local, regional government bodies, the sector bodies. It really is about that strength of partnership that's going to make this different. But it should be collaborative. You know, in designing it should be collaboratively designed across all the different partners so that it is actually going to deliver something meaningful and focusing on new activity, not just a bid that you've got tucked up your sleeve that hasn't quite got funding yet. This is new. Way up front, Andrew mentioned about the fact that, yes, we are the Arts and Humanities Research Council, but actually this should be multidisciplinary. So do bring in the expertise that is going to make a difference to this challenge. It's not just, as Andrew said earlier, about bringing a room full of philosophers and historians together because that's what you think we are expecting to see as AHRC. We want to make sure that the expertise on the bid, whether from academia or from industry, is the best to deliver this challenge, the solution to these challenges. And make sure it is dynamic. Yeah, so we do want a very clear challenge articulated up front, but we do recognise that actually these things will evolve. So you need your challenge, you need a very clear approach on how you're going to tackle this, but we do understand that it will evolve as time goes on. As part of the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund team, way back sort of this time last year when the Chancellor announced all this extra money and we went hurrah, we spent a long time thinking about what a challenge might actually look like. And I think if you look at some of the ones that were announced, the Faraday Challenge and the medical sciences ones, there is a very strong challenge articulated there about what is going to be addressed. So where the economic growth for the UK is going to come from, whether that is in products, services, jobs, and you need to be thinking about that in exactly the same way. Make sure you are articulating that challenge. But again, it needs to be rooted in the needs of the sector. So again, that existing cluster that you are looking to enhance, what is the challenge that really speaks to that cluster? Is it recognised by industry? You know, there is no point in doing something that is just, you know, thought of by the academic sector. It really needs an industry pull. That's how the growth for the UK is going to really come about. So again, make sure it is focused on creating products, services, experiences. And actually, do you have the right expertise to address that challenge? That is really making sure you have got the best expertise to develop that that cluster, enhance it, and address that challenge. And yes, we are looking for impact, so there will need to be something that is measurable. When we go back to Treasury, when these clusters have delivered, we need to be able to say, look, you invested £51 million, here is the return on that investment. So make sure you are you're building in the measurement right at the start. And there will be some help from the AHRC team as well in doing that. So key points to really drive home and take home with you. So make sure that your bid has strategy and vision. What are the strengths of the particular cluster that you're going to be enhancing, developing? Who are all the different partners? What strengths are they going to bring to this particular bid? And I will drive home that point. What is the challenge that you're going to solve or address? That is really important. And how will the cluster that you're looking to enhance, develop, how will it actually benefit from that expertise of the partnership that you're drawing together? This is about collaborative R&D, so that's a really key point to bring out in your bids. So what programme of activities will you have that will create these products, services, and the growth that we're looking for? How does it relate back to that strategy and vision piece? And making sure that you do have that strength of expertise in the collaboration as well. Creating answers to challenges that really are being faced by industry. And we will test some, you know, we will ask, so there's no hiding that it's not something that is being needed by industry. And another key point is about the leadership. It really does need strong and shared leadership within the bid to make it successful. And what you might have picked up from the call documents is that the director of whatever one of these clusters could be doesn't have to be based in the HEI. So the eagle eye might have spotted that. So you are probably really au fait with the milestones now, and obviously the 27th of October is looming close now. But yeah, it's a tight deadline. You know, this time next year will be the start of all these partnerships. And a final thought, and if I get this wrong, Andrew, I apologise. So previously we've seen that we've had research about the creative economy, and we'd probably expect the Policy and Evidence Centre to be doing this piece about research about the creative economy. We've had previously invested in research with the creative economy. Think the KE hubs that we've previously invested in. What I want to drive home is that this is not just reinventing the KE hubs. This is something new and something different. This is much more about research for the creative economy, making sure that we are properly working in partnership with the creative economy to really provide solutions to challenges and drive economic growth within the UK. So I think that's where I stop and we then answer some questions. Neat segue. So I'm going to get Andrew back up and also Dylan, who's from the AH team as well. And I believe there's some mics around as well, so I will leave Andrew to chair this bit.
Oh, okay, all right. You have a...
So I'll sit
go for
down
it, come
now.
to seats.
Yeah.
And, so hopefully you've all got some really, really, really difficult questions. And hopefully some we haven't heard before over the 5 of these we've done before. So, yeah, please, we'll start at the front.
In terms of the funding, in the document, there's this magic figure of 33%, and I've tried every possible way of working out the figures, and I can't see how you come up with 33%, if anyone else has worked it out.
This is 33% match funding?
Yeah.
Is it? Okay, I'm very interested in the answer to this myself.
So I think the first thing to say, and this is a bit of a plug for this afternoon, are you coming along to this afternoon session? Because we've got a variety of slides and different ways of displaying that. So basically, the way that figure comes about is because that's the proposition that we put to Bayes in terms of the match funding that we think is possible based on previous investments that we've made. So I think the best way to look at it is, say on one of these R&D partnerships, the amount of AHRC funding can be in a range of around £4 to £6 million per partnership. So if you take the top level of that at £6 million, what we'd be looking for is a kind of matched or leveraged funding amount of around about 50% of that total. So that would be then 3 million. So if you put the 6 million and the 3 million together, then you have roughly a third. Then there's FEC kind of complicates things a little bit on top of that, but I'll explain that this afternoon. But I don't know, does that help or?
Oh, I see. It's you said of the total.
Yeah.
And so I thought the total was the total bid rather than
Yeah.
the total.
No, I think when we were putting the bid together, the way that Bayes or government understand it is the amount of money they're giving us to invest in it. So that's kind of how we were looking at it.
Okay, Anthony, down, so 3 rows back. Here comes Virginie with the mic.
Hello. I was just interested in the allocation of funds across the consortium. Given it's AHRC money, how much money has to go directly through to the HEI partners and how much is allowed to be spent by others, especially including industry in the R&D that happens as well?
So can I have a go at that first and then you can tell me where I've got this wrong? I think the interesting thing is this is money, industrial strategy money, routed through the research councils. So it all lands with the HEI. Unusually for research council money, up to 30% can pass straight through to non-academic partners. So that's quite unusual. But what I would say is also, and this is partly having a foot in both camps, is there are ways of working and delivering benefit, significant benefit to companies that would be outside that figure as well. So if you think about whether that's, so funding that might stay within HEI partners, but might be fellowships that bring people in, that kind of thing. So I think there's quite a lot of flexibility. And so I think it's quite unusual in that aspect. If people, I think hard, they'll find ways of making that 30% larger or not as required by the partnership.
Yeah, the only thing I'd really add is that obviously the entire focus of this programme is around sort of equitable partnerships. So I think the expectation is that all of the partners within the consortium can benefit but also contribute into the programme. So that the expectation is not that everything sits with the lead or host HEI. There's an expectation that support will come from all of the organisations or entities that are involved in the bid.
I think we had a question at the back there. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to go back to the regional map you showed from the Nestor analysis of the 47 clusters. If a cluster doesn't appear on that map, is it effectively ruled out of scope?
No, not at all. I think, one of the reasons to release this new data that's cut by subsector was to see if it revealed a different cluster patterns, and I think we all agree it does. There's a lot further to go, and we're going to work with Juan and Hassan on that. But I think it doesn't rule it out at all. So you have some clusters that are very strong in a particular sector that appear. I think it's just so that we all know what the baseline evidence says. so that it is slightly to guard against people making a claim that there are of world-class clusters in what are essentially greenfield sites. So I don't think you should feel ruled out by it. I think it's just a reference point. I think it's also interesting, we've talked a lot today about the geography of clusters. I think the core document makes it clear that there is also a way of looking at this which is sectoral, and look at the geography within the sector. So you might have a sectoral cluster with perhaps less core geography that may be differently shaped. So hopefully it gives people the flexibility to put bids together, but gives us a bit of a baseline as to what the current data shows. Do you want?
No, I just think it's about that issue of credibility. Is the cluster that you're proposing a credible cluster, or is it just something that you think might be valuable or beneficial? But I think if you make the case for it, and you make a strong case, and it's recognised by our reviewers and the programme, then I think that's fine.
Yeah, John, who's just in front there.
Just on that.
John, actually, might be helpful for everybody if everybody says who they are and where they're from. What
my
institution.
goodness, I'm the first person. Hello, everyone. I'm John Weinbrand. I'm from the University of Surrey. So just a quick question following on from that question. Geographic spread. So, you know, there looks like very defined regionality and the definition of cluster being very defined. But I'm just I think people are probably curious about what the fluidity of geographic spread and sort of extension creep, if you like, is possible if it's that advantageous to a particular area to collaborate with another area, etc.
You start. Where'd you start with that? Where'd you start with that?
Where'd you start? But I guess, again, it comes down to credibility. So you can't, well, it depends how fluid that particular cluster that you're focusing on is going to be. Because what this isn't about is giving 8 different HEIs a little bit of money, like we may have seen happen in other competitions. This is about actually addressing a proper challenge in a proper existing cluster. So I think if you're making the case for fluidity around place, then just be very clear in what your arguments are.
Yeah. And I guess if you're bringing in organisations that are outside of what initially looks like the boundaries of that cluster, they have to have a very, very clear role about what they're being brought in to do, and what they're being brought in to do has to respond specifically to the challenge of what that partnership is addressing. So it's about that credibility and really making the case strongly why everybody who's involved in that bid is involved in that bid and what they're doing.
No, although I think Rory raised that this morning, and I would be so grateful if people had catchy names rather than awful acronyms that seem to be the bane of every ERDF project. It's like the KE hubs, and then create. So we had create, we had react. You can never remember which one's which. I just think on the point, John, I think what you're driving at. So I'm guessing, but the games industry, say, is characterised by a set of geographical clusters, and you're wondering whether you could create a partnership which accommodated more than one of those geographical clusters, for instance.
It's a Theresa May type hypothetical question.
Yeah, so I think the thing to be, so we are open to the idea of sectoral clusters, but you're really going to have to make the case as to how the benefits and the mechanisms of geographical clustering, the equivalents of how those companies work together, how they're involved in supply chains, how they can collaborate, how they can share workforce, all of those things, how that works if the focus isn't geography. So I think we're open to it. I think one of the things is, and I think Alex kind of referred to this with the KE hubs, is there's been lots of incentives for lots of universities to collaborate. That may not be the right approach in this for this proposition. It may be that we're talking about something that isn't like the KE hubs, it's much tighter, and that's defined by the industry. So we're open to it, but it's just a question of making the case, and particularly about how are the benefits of clustering expressed in a diffuse model like that, if you see what I mean. Yep, let's go down the front.
I'm Sarah Dance. I'm not from an HEI. I actually represent a cluster. So I'm chair of the Kent Cultural Transformation Board and also co-chair of the South East Creative Economy Network. And I just wanted to ask a question about measurability in terms of economic growth. And it's also partly linked to what Rory was saying earlier. And how you want to define that measurability, because we know, for example, that freelancing is really important within the creative economy, but that doesn't often get counted because you're talking about FTEs all the time. So it's a question about that.
I think we're going to, with this programme, which is probably slightly different to other stuff that we tend to fund, where we don't really have the resource to put a lot of manpower into helping the people that we funded do things like articulating value and impact and that sort of stuff. We've actually got some specific resource put aside for this programme to actually work with the people who are funded on exactly those kinds of questions. So I think, obviously we're going to have to provide evidence and information about exactly what these things are doing, but the sort of standard ways that you would usually measure this kind of stuff for maybe other sectors might not necessarily apply to these, and we completely understand and appreciate that. So we're going to put some time aside, I think, to actually work with the people who are doing these projects to try and work out how you best tell the story about what your project is actually doing and achieving. And also the other thing, what we're acutely aware of, is we want the majority of funding in this programme to go into funding activity that is actually going to benefit the creative industries, not for you to spend an awful lot of time thinking about how you're going to capture information and report back to us. So I think we will try and support you through that process.
I think it's one of Rory's classic. There's bad news and there's good news. The bad news is it is going to have to be measured. The good news is, at the moment, we're not constrained into those kind of ERDF metrics of jobs preserved, jobs created. And I think the issue around what is a job in the creative sector is one that we're definitely trying to accommodate within that. And hopefully we'll work with, as we get a cohort that moves through into the stage 2 bits, we'll work with people and ideas about how to capture something that is more meaningful.
Yeah, and I've got a feeling that the Policy and Evidence Centre is probably going to want to look at stuff like that and work with the partnerships that are funded and also other research that's happening in the creative industries that's outside of the programme, just to try and really kind of strengthen up what good evidence and what solid data looks like in this sector.
Yeah, we'll go down there before we come back for a second bite.
Hello, Eva Fata from Bartlett UCL. I have two questions. One of them is related to humanities and the definition of humanities. Is it the institute? Is it the school? Is it the track record? Because we tend to work in multidisciplinary ways. So you're trained as architect, then you work with technologies, then you publish in HCI. So how do you define this? The other one is whether you can submit more than one bid from one institution. So I'm aware in UCL there's been now a lot of partnerships building up. Whether the person also can be in more than one of these as well.
Yeah. So I'll take the first one first because it's a bit easier. You can be involved in more than one bid. You can only lead one bid. So if UCL was going to put in an application as a host HEI, they could only put in one. They can be involved in other bids if they want to. I guess the question will come then if these bids are shortlisted through to the second stage and they're asked to submit a full application. There may be some questions around whether, if it's the same people involved in two bids, for example, whether they've actually got the capacity to do that. The question is fundamentally, are they the right people to work against the challenge? So it could be that they are the right people to work against two separate challenges under two different bids. That's for you to articulate.
Lead. Or the researcher can submit as a lead. So is it like you have multiple bids from UCL and the same person can be once a lead and something else?
No, we're saying that the institution can only submit one as a lead. And so I think they need to make the choice over which one they wanted to.
And this is probably where this is slightly different. So, this isn't about the individual researcher being the host. This is about the institution being the host. So it's slightly changing mindset, and that is about putting the, I think I said in my presentation, it's about putting that bid in. host, that's where the money's going to flow through, but it's really about the strength of the partnership behind that.
And in terms of your other question around the kind of definition of the humanities, I think the thing to sort of try and get across with this programme is we're not really thinking about it as disciplinary tied. So it's about the right people to do the right work. So they could come from whatever department, depending on what methodologies they're using or what their research actually does. That research has to be directly, instrumentally related to what the challenges that they're actually responding to. So I don't know whether that answers your question or what.
Because you highlighted the issue about traditionally automotive industry or a pharma industry and so on lead on these kind of projects. But if somebody, for instance, only as an example, from computer science will be the ideal person to lead on the whole bid, is that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, from our point of view, that's absolutely fine.
I think of it at the institutional level. So we're not thinking about this at the disciplinary level. We're thinking about how will that institution host this partnership in order to address the particular challenge for that cluster. So it's not disciplinary based at all.
And I think, given the focus on products, services and experiences, I think we'd be very, very surprised if there wasn't any arts and humanities involvement in it. And obviously we're the Arts and Humanities Research Council, so we want to see that community doing well and thriving in a programme like this. But it really is about getting the right people with the right blend of expertise.
But it's fair to say that the AHRC's remit includes the whole of the design sector. So, it's...
Not manufacturing so much.
Well, the design part of it. I think the other thing is maybe the way through this is to, and it's been interesting going around the country at the stage that people are at with developing their kind of conversations and shaping up bids, is to think about the role of the industry at this stage and industry partners in defining what the partnership is trying to do. So I think if I could encourage one thing, it would be to encourage people to get beyond the institutional politics of this and beyond the HEI relationships and what makes a good bid. I'm sure nobody in this room would do this, but there are certain regions who think the answer to this is every HEI in a geography joins together some mega bid. That seems to me very unlikely to be able to meet our criteria because it's actually about where the industry clusters are and what the industry's challenges are. So I think if the quicker we move to that, and I know it's hard for academic institutions and they need to talk about these things in great detail, but it's possibly a bit like a conversation with a university about IP. It can go on forever, but it doesn't lead anywhere interesting. Yeah, sorry, down here.
Hi, I'm Dom. I run a creative business in one of the clusters in Slough, and I also sit on the Thames Valley Berkshire LEP as a volunteer. My question is about the latter, which is what, if any, involvement or links do you see to the LEPs and how integral are they to the bids? Because we're getting a lot of approaches.
Shall I take that one? I see them as absolutely integral to the bids. I think it's really important that, well, when I say integral, I can imagine a bid that doesn't have a LEP in it. Because there are some of our really strong creative clusters who, I think it would be, perhaps sounds unfair, but I'll say it anyway, who have grown despite the LEPs or without active participation from their LEPs. But I think the LEPs act as a kind of condensation point for a whole series of strategies. And there are LEPs that care deeply about the creative industries and have strategies. So I think that I would expect them to be very much involved in the conversation. And obviously, Berkshire has a particular focus for its creative industry strategy. Other LEPs don't. So I think the more they, from our point of view, the LEPs act as a way of convening a lot of the industry and strategy around this, within which it's its part. And if they've got active policies that they're pursuing, aligning it with this would seem to be sensible. Was that what you were hoping for? How are we doing? Right, we've got one down in the centre here.
Thank you, Jay Gascoigne from the University of Exeter. The functional economic zones which lend themselves to this kind of geographical clustering often sort of merge with each other or overlap each other. So I was wondering, what's the scope for clusters to interact with other or neighbouring clusters?
Yeah, I think we've been non-prescriptive in our description of what a cluster is to say that we're not limited within local government boundaries or functional zones or anything like that. So I think if the entities or businesses or organisations are outside of what would be normally deemed a defined area, then that's absolutely fine.
And can I
but
just
making
ask,
the case, obviously, for why that is the case.
so does that extend to the kind of industry partnerships as well? If a cluster was, say, regionally based, could the partnerships be national and international?
Yeah, they could be. I think it's about how does it benefit ultimately we're looking at benefiting and growing creative clusters. So if the majority of the benefit is happening outside of that cluster, then the question would be asked, I would imagine, what's it actually doing for that cluster? But it could be that it's a national or international, global even business or organisation that are actually doing something that's delivering within that cluster and enabling the businesses that they're working with, say, for example, within that cluster to actually grow.
I mean, I think picking up on the international point as well, obviously export would be a big impact from these potentially, but the aims of the programme are about UK economic growth, so it's just making sure you hold that in your mind as well.
Yeah, and I think just to reinforce that, I think we'd be very interested in industrial partners that are located in the UK but have global reach. Perhaps more interested in that than in research partnerships with global reach. Yep, down there.
Hi, Jo Nolan from Screen South, which is a cultural development agency based in the South Kent. There's just one question really, and it's around money, but there was a clear intention that should be equity investment, hard money involved in some of the works that I read. And it hasn't been mentioned this morning in terms of investment in products and services and experiences. Is that, because we haven't mentioned it this morning, but I clearly got that from the reading that I've done around it. Is it something that...
So this, sorry, just to clarify,
equity.
So this would be equity investment in companies or in...
As a percentage of the funds going into this project, that it was mentioned, there was no percentage, but it was mentioned that partners would be investors, potential investors,
right,
and equity
okay,
investors.
okay.
So looking at the patchwork of funds, and so you've mentioned 33% and da-da-da, but you haven't mentioned anything this morning, apart from Caroline, obviously, but specifically on what you might see as a percentage of equity investment going into these schemes.
Yeah, I guess it's as appropriate for what they're doing with the partnership. I mean, in terms of the involvement from partners for contributing into the programme, we're not necessarily dictating that has to be cash. It could be an in-kind investment or, some facilities or the loan of some equipment or something along those lines, but we're not really...
But you haven't asked for kind of industry investment?
Well, no, not specifically, but I think if there was a bid with substantial industry investment coming in as part of the match funding, I think that would look great. I think it would be really good if we could say, we've managed to leverage industry to invest into this programme. I think that would be a really good outcome for whoever put the bid in or for the programme more widely. But I think we can't we're a bit reluctant to set that expectation, I think, at the outset.
Okay, because it would be, if it's successful in the long-term reporting, that you would see that hard investment because of the work that was undertaken, but it's not a hard kind of cause that you need to put in at the beginning of your... No,
and I think what we were trying to do more at a programme level is also try and find some of that investment in from bigger organisations. I think I guess the issue is with the creative sector is there's quite a lot of small businesses, freelancers, and them having the cash to be able to actually pump money into the R&D partnership. I think we maybe thought that might be a bit unrealistic.
It'd be nice if it could happen, but you're not asking for it.
Yeah, no, it's not, yeah.
I think it's fair to say we know how difficult that's going to be, and in different geographies as well, it's more difficult than in others. And so we're trying to kind of, it's desirable, but we know that we can't put a figure on it. And as Dylan says, what we're developing in parallel is a national partner group as well, so that as bids evolve, we can perhaps introduce some of those national partners, potentially as funding partners as well into the bids, whereas it's probably, given them slightly accelerated timescales, it's impossible to let that just happen.
So we might put the emphasis on access to finance activities rather than quoting any sort of figure for investment. Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Right down the back, with the beautiful blue lighting.
Sorry, just going back to this money business. So the statistics that you gave, so say you've got 6 million and then you get another 3 million in as match funding. Mm-hmm. Now, are you going to do what the Arts Council would do and say that a percentage of this must be a cash contribution?
No.
So most of that 3 million could be in kind?
It could be in kind, yeah.
Oh.
I mean, obviously you're going to have to have a kind of robust system for recording what that is. I mean, I think just saying, like, at the end of the award, we've got £3 million worth of in kind, that we're going to need to see some way of actually recording that. But this is what we were talking about in terms of us supporting you to capture the evidence, that kind of thing. If there was cash investment, that would be fantastic, I think. But, I mean, realistically, given the sector, we think in-kind could be a lot, and it could be in-kind not necessarily just from organisations, creative businesses, organisations, but also from the HEIs themselves as well.
Brilliant, thank you.
I'd encourage certainly the HEIs to think about this creatively with the businesses as well, because most creative businesses are actually very good at recording time and money devoted to activities. And it's often underestimated, I think, by universities just how good they are at it, because I was going to say we then, I'm not supposed to say that anymore, but we do this for a living, and we charge people on the basis of time in many bits of the creative sector. We're really good at recording it. Anthony, you get your second bite now, yes.
Hello, I'm Anthony Story from Silicon South, which is sort of industry clustering, as it turns out, which represents the Bournemouth and Dorset end of the Creative Coast, Rory's Creative Coast.
Silicon South, Creative Coast,
it's all happening.
Working on the names.
Yeah. So I'm just kind of interested a little bit around content, because some of the things that we mentioned are around focused on R&D. There's been mentioned in terms of what this can do around overcoming the Brexit problems, potential problems. And also Caroline was also talking about talent pipelines and things like that. And I just wondered if you had an idea in your mind in terms of particular areas which you're going to be sympathetic to in terms of when it comes to looking at what you're really trying to achieve.
I can have a go at that. So somebody asked me after we did the gig in Birmingham, so are we looking for a games cluster, are we looking for a content cluster, are we looking for an AV cluster, architect? No, we're not. That's entirely up to you. It's about what the cluster's challenges are and what the cluster's strengths are. So we're not going to define that. I think it's right that that comes from the bottom up, otherwise this makes no sense. I think, and I may be misinterpreting, but content's a really interesting one. So I think if underlying that as a question of can this stuff fund content, I would flip that round and say, can these programs fund content? The question is, why would they? So if the challenge to a cluster, the R&D challenge to a cluster is that would be best solved by the collaborative development of a new kind of content, then that seems fine. But if it's, should these funds be used to develop content in businesses of the type they're currently producing, I wouldn't have thought so. That's how I would kind of see that. But I think the main message is the what. We've given guidelines of what we need you to do, but the actual what, the focus, the R&D program that each of these successful bids will put forward has to come from below. It can't come from us because we can't describe the challenges that those businesses face. And that's a similar problem if we wanted to say, we want a games cluster, we want that, we would be intervening, we would be setting a kind of direction that would be prejudging those things. So we may end up with one that focuses on games and one that focuses on screen media or whatever, but that's not our decision to make, I don't think. Do you want to?
I would just reinforce that. You are sat in the best place to know what the challenge that your cluster is facing and what will really make a difference by this kind of intervention. So we're not being prescriptive, but just make, the strongest ones are really going to be that challenge-led and solution-focused. So we're looking forward to seeing what the challenges are.
How are we doing? Kate O'Connor, right over the furthest from the microphone you could get.
Here for Yorkshire, as the cluster. My question is, it's really a repetition bit. That's the motif of the morning.
Yeah,
said.
we like repetition.
So just
as long as it's the right bits, Kate.
Just to repeat that very last point, you won't be looking for your success measures to result in a nice inclusive sector coverage or a nice inclusive geographical coverage. I.e., it could be that the
Did we say that?
the 8 R&D partnerships could be all located in a particular
Yorkshire.
Could be.
For instance.
And could be around similar, in fact, just a couple of the sectors. So that's not something you'll design into the process in any way, some sort of equitable distribution.
There's a lovely Research Council piece of terminology that we've used in the thing, which is balanced portfolio.
Uh-huh.
So I don't think it's very likely that we're going to be funding 8 fashion bids that are all based in London, for example.
Right.
That just wouldn't seem to fit the aims of what the programme is all about. It might be that we do get 8 very strong ones, but I mean, then the question would be maybe they should be working together a bit more. I don't know, but I think we are kind of responsible for trying to deliver a programme of kind of national scale.
Yes.
So I think if it is focused entirely on one region, it probably isn't going to be achieving what the actual aims of the programme are. But yeah.
So you don't want to see a clustering of the clusters, do you? You want to see it more.
Probably not. I think it's what it's like, Kate. There are influences on a program like this. So this is Bayes. This is we know that the current Secretary of State is very concerned that all of these strategies have a rebalancing the economy element. That we know that the dynamics of the creative industries have a certain geography to them. Do we work with that geography? Do we work against that geography? Do we try and use that to perhaps support geographical areas where they don't have the strengths of inside the M25, which some would argue is super served in terms of investment, in terms of workforce and all those things? So I think it's, we have not got a secret list. We haven't got a map of the UK divided into regions where we're trying to put pins on boards. Would we expect to use Dylan's lovely phrase, a balanced portfolio, to encourage to have that as one aspect of what we're thinking about? Yes, but we mainly want great bids.
Excellent.
And then the second stage process, so just perhaps it reflects on the process a bit. First stage process, we expect to shortlist, say, I don't know, I think we're saying 14 or so, something like that. It's a manageable number, and work with those propositions. So we'll look for any synergies or design bits or trying to bring them with these national partners together to discuss things, but no, we haven't yet been told to draw up the UK and stick pins on a board. Sorry, so we're going down the front, and
thank you. I'm David Aaron, I'm a physician from Southampton University. Must our partners be committed by October the 27th or by December?
Short answer to that is no. I mean, I think what we want to get a good...
No.
They don't need to be committed by...
October the 27th is the statement of intent.
Oh,
Must
right,
they be committed by then?
No. I mean, if you can give us an indication of who your partners are likely to be at that point, that would be really good.
And at what time do you need confirmation?
Well, I think what we're saying with the process is we're describing it as a kind of dynamic process. I think by the time you get to stage 2, I think we'd like to see some good, solid partners involved with a good, solid commitment from them as to what they're going to do with the programme. But what we're saying as well is that during the first year of that funding period, it's unlikely there'll be an enormous amount of R&D activity happening in that first year, but what you will be doing is working with those partners to really sharpen up what the challenges are that you're working on, refine them, and actually think what's actually going to be really valuable for this cluster and for this configuration of partners. So by that point, it may be that some partners drop in or out of the bid, but so we will expect a development, but for that statement of intent stage, just a kind of runners and riders really would be good, I think, at that point.
Yeah, I mean, the statement of intent, I think, is partly for us to then have a cohort of people to talk to. You're not going to be held to the things that are in that. Some partners might use the statement of intent, or some people leading bids, to search for business partners. We're happy to kind of help that. And similarly, businesses will approach us and see, and perhaps we can connect them through. The only thing the statement of intent holds you to is, if you want to lead a bid, you must put in a statement of intent. You cannot enter at the stage 1 stage. That's the only constraint. Yep.
Now a couple, and also from University of Exeter, as my colleague Jay. I would like to ask a question about the assessment process in more detail. Obviously, this is not our kind of usual research type funding or funding opportunity, and I'm presuming that industry representatives will be sitting on a panel. So can you tell us more about the kind of the assessment?
We're not approaching this in the standard Arts and Humanities Research Council way of assessing bids, so it won't be a kind of 3 peer review, then a moderation panel type of process, because I don't think that will accurately capture the multidisciplinarity and the fact that there's a big industry and partner buy-in to it. So the way we're going to do this is going to be via a kind of assessment panel. The assessment panel is going to be constructed of an appropriate balanced, this is kind of actually what we want the SOI statements of intent as well, so that we know what kind of bids are coming, help us construct a panel that's actually fit for purpose for the types of bids that we're actually going to be looking at. So the makeup of that is likely to feature some arts and humanities academics that maybe from our peer review college, maybe potentially looking more at the kind of strategic reviewers or people with the experience as a strategic overview of working with industry kind of programs. We'll also be looking at colleagues from our EPSRC and ESRC colleges as well, because there could potentially be other aspects of those bids that will be coming from those other councils. But we're also going to try and get a strong industry involvement on the panel as well, and also from other entities, sector bodies, trade bodies, those kind of things, just to make sure that we've actually got people looking at the bids who actually understand what the bids are trying to do. So, so I think we're taking that process really seriously at the moment, because I think our understanding of it is this programme either lives or dies by the peer review, because I think if you multidisciplinary bids traditionally don't necessarily get a fair shot with the traditional peer review structure. So we're going to be more like a sort of collaborative model of discussion and reading, and everyone on the panel will see all of the bids as well, so they're able to discuss it in a relative term.
Should just take one last question, and then we'll move to the panel, and we'll perhaps unpack some of these ideas there as well. Anybody want to volunteer their one last question? No, apparently not. So, okay, great. Well, thanks for that. Thanks to Alex and Dylan. Obviously, for those staying for the bid writing session afterwards, they can pursue some of those more technical questions in more detail. So first onto the panel, John Newbegin. John has, Rory talked earlier about the creative industries being a constructed and named concept, and I suppose in many ways John Newbegin has more to do with that than almost anybody. John's working currently with the Mayor's team. He's the founding chair of Creative England. And also, John, you chair the Creative Industries Council group talking about clusters. So John can take us into, I think, particularly the area of the wider concept of clusters and where this programme fits in. Next up, Beatrice Pembroke, who is the Director of Creative Economy for the British Council. So that's it's an interesting thing that I think for Beatrice, that the creative industries and the creative economy is a UK export in many ways, both as the products of the creative economy, but also as the ideas around it themselves. So perhaps we'll be able to inquire into that. And John Wardle. John is the director of the National Film and Television School, which is a very, very interesting institution in this context, as essentially an industry-funded organisation that has become a university, but obviously concerned with a very high-level skill development in the screen industries. So, hopefully that all made sense to you guys. John, do you want to kick off? You did invent the concept of the creative industries, and now you seem to be driving forward clusters as this kind of point of leverage for taking ideas forward. There were a few questions about geography versus sector. How do you see that as clusters? Because that's a hard one, isn't it?
Yeah, I didn't invent creative industries. It came out of collective thinking, like all good things do. I think I was going to say a whole lot of things before you asked me a particular question, and I might say that anyway. But okay. Because I think thinking about what Rory said this morning, I've just read a book about the history of GDP by Diana Coyle, the Manchester economist, who has this great thing at the end and says, and talking about the fourth industrial revolution and robotization and job generation, which is obviously one of the things that we're concerned with here in terms of impact. And she says, anything that can be measured in terms of productivity is something that ultimately will be done by a robot. So what humans are good at is, she says, wasting time, playing, experimenting, and creating things. So those are the things that you can't measure in terms of productivity and are probably pretty safe for humans to carry on doing, but actually they are also the foundations for long-term growth. So teasing those things out, I think is really important. It's quite a kind of serious point. The other thing I was going to say, just on the points that Alex put up, it's not a research about the creative economy or with the creative economy, it's for the creative economy. But actually, you, of course, in the real world, you can't kind of disentangle some of that. And I think one of the things, and I will get around to answering your question, but one of the things which I think if you haven't looked at the industrial strategy green paper that was published in January, it's worth having a look at it because that's what kind of underpins this all in terms of government thinking. And they cite 10 pillars as the sort of keys for the industrial strategy. And 2 of them I thought were quite surprising. One was, it's the 10th pillar, but they say the creation of new institutions that bring together sector and place. And while we're not talking about new institutions, I think all the emphasis on collaboration and partnership this morning, actually, in a way, if new institutions come out of this, I mean, you referenced the LEPs, for example. If there are institutions or structures that bring together universities and LEPs and private business and cultural organizations, that is something which the government really is looking for. And I think it's genuinely surprising. I mean, when I read that in a Bayes document, I practically fell off my chair, but it's there. And I think it's something that's worth thinking about. And then the other thing, which I thought was quite surprising in the Green Paper, is they reference procurement, public procurement from SMEs. And the ambition should be that 1/3 of all public procurement, which currently runs at whatever, 200 billion a year or something, should come from SMEs. And it seems to me that links to the sector and place thing, that actually if sourcing public goods and public services is going to come from the creative sector, that's something which actually we don't really understand very much about and haven't done very much work about. And in fact, in Creative England, one of the things that we have done quite a lot of work on is how you get small creative organizations thinking about the delivery of public services. So you may have seen one of the slides that Caroline put up referenced the NHS. We got an investment partnership with the NHS, which really, I mean, the strap line I wanted for that was non-clinical solutions to what you think are clinical problems. And I think, there's a lot of that going on. And I think in terms of these partnerships, to be thinking about procurement is quite important because one of the real growth areas for the creative industries is B2B relationships. It's not just about, it is producing consumer products and consumer services and consumer experiences, but a lot of it is about B2B. And I think thinking through some of these structures and what they might deliver is an angle which is quite easy to kind of forget about. So that was one of the things that I wanted to say. I'm
going to push you on the question.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So geography and sector, because what is a cluster?
Well, again, just referencing the UN in their last report on the creative economy had this really good thing. There ain't no such thing as the creative economy because every region is different. And I think that thing of one of the important things to come out of this program is to have initiatives that do focus on geography. Some of them may. Some of them are going to focus on sector. Some of them are going to focus on theme. And I think all the points you were making a moment ago, Andrew, there needs to be a kind of spread. But I think the real value of this program is that although clusters seem to work, actually the real dynamics of clusters is something we don't understand very clearly. So having a good spread of propositions, some of which are perhaps the geography is very important, and some of which the theme or the particular skill or the particular subsector is important, that in itself is going to be absolutely crucial. So I think, and to ignore any one of those dimensions would be a real mistake. So it's a very short answer.
Beatrice, you're taking your jacket off. I thought you were going to start a fight then for a minute, but so that issue of size and shape and how clusters work is something that British Council have done some work on and actually pointing to some of the mechanisms within that. Do you perhaps want to riff on that a little bit? And
So obviously British Council is a cultural organisation, and we're particularly interested in making links with people overseas. And for the last few years, we've been looking at the role of what we called hubs in the creative economy. And we use that as quite a broad term. So it can be anything from a more sort of official government-led cluster to really quite a small art studio space. But the idea is that these are spaces and places, whether physical or online, where people can come together from different backgrounds that have a kind of imaginative entrepreneurial spirit and are making creative value. And we did some research with City University, University of the West of England, and Watershed, which you should probably know is a hub, a creative hub in the southwest, to look at how these hubs operated and what value they had. And the evidence that came back was that A, they are not very well understood at the moment, but they are part of a very important ecosystem rooted in their local space, and understanding how to make those ecosystems work and where to make the connections. And a lot of the stuff that's come up today is vital, but having a sort of diversity of space and type is the important thing.
So you think that maybe it's a lot of HAIs thinking about where to kind of develop bids. So would you say look at hubs that actually any functioning cluster is likely to have that kind of space or need that kind of space, and
Yes.
incorporate them into the...
Yes, I would say reach out to your networks and to the smaller hubs and organisations that you are connected to, and think about how they are experimenting, because they have perhaps more room, more space, more time to experiment in a way that you can't, and think about what you can learn from each other. And this is already happening in lots of places. A lot of the creative hubs that we work with have very strong university links. Quite often they're acting as the hub is acting as a gateway for industry to connect to university or HEI resources and speak a language that perhaps an HEI can't sometimes.
So they've got a kind of translation potential between the different partners, which is interesting. Okay, John, nice easy question then. The screen industries, which, your working life's been spent in the interface between higher education and the screen industries. So how are the screen industries clustered?
So according to your map, very much around the M25 and a bit of Glasgow. And I think what's really interesting is whether you're looking at data of what's happening now or what's about to happen. So two things I want to say about that. One is Ofcom have just done a review around out-of-London production, which will push broadcasters and productions to move beyond lift and shift and actually make content in the nations and the regions. The BBC, Channel 4, all of those big companies are looking at what they do beyond London. I was in Wales on Friday, and I don't think I've been to a studio space more exciting than what's happening in Cardiff at the moment, and it's kind of under the radar. A company called Bad Wolf Studios, they've set up a studio complex called Wolf Studios. They've got 3 high-end TV commissions. One is His Dark Materials for Philip Pullman, one is Discovery of Witches for HBO, and another which is called The Industry, I think, for Netflix. That's 3 shows made just outside Cardiff with a huge studio complex ready to welcome other shows. So according to your map, that wouldn't be a cluster, the data doesn't support a cluster being there. But actually, I think what we're seeing politically and in how production companies are starting to think is actually maybe they're moving beyond the London and the South East, not entirely, but actually there is a case to be made for a cluster being elsewhere.
Yeah, and I love the way that you neatly put Glasgow in there.
Yeah, we've just opened a base there. So.
Yeah, just so that everybody knows that. So let's go this way back around the panel. Then thinking about these things, we've placed a heavy emphasis on developing the what of these bids around challenges faced by sectors or by clusters. Yeah. So I'd like to ask each of you is. That's not an easy thing to do, bring people together to identify challenges. But from what you know, starting with John in the screen sector, what are the challenges of the screen sector? How do you bring that together, and how do you address it with R&D?
The first thing I'd say is I've been approached, as an institution, we've been approached by a number of institutions looking to lead a bid. I'm not sure they fully heard the focus on challenges. It seems to be about building a coalition at the moment. It seems to be about...
Still about institutions.
It's still about institutions, and it's still with like your name on our application. So I'm not sure people are writing around saying, these are the challenges we're trying to solve. Are you interested in solving them with us?
Yep.
Which is maybe where the starting point should be. I can pick one. I mean, I think the thing we're being contacted about the most at the moment is around storytelling in a 360 world. What does point of view look like? What does montage look like? How do you tell stories in this new form? And so that's technology companies contacting us, that's broadcasters, that's production companies, all looking to fund content which might become exploitable IP for them. And so that's an area where there's pull from the industry rather than us trying to push an agenda on them.
So that's a really interesting, it's a really kind of, I've heard the same thing, it's a really kind of clear challenge, which is after 130 years of developing a language for film, none of it works in an immersive environment, what the hell do we do? Kind of challenge.
And it seems like it's not like 3D, it's not going away. I think VR is a new medium that people are trying to look at how you tell stories in. I have a question for you though. How do these clusters fit with the other AHRC call around immersive?
Oh,
Sorry to turn it round.
No. I can explain that probably. It's all part of a grand strategy, and it all fits together brilliantly. So another area that in the consultations around the industrial strategy, there was a really clear message coming out around the challenge for immersive technologies, not just in the creative industries, but in edutech or or manufacturing. So we do anticipate that there will be future funding from the industrial strategy around immersives. And also, we may have clusters come together, bids to come together here where that's their focus. So what we wanted to do with the other challenge was to get out there first and give some people some development money so they get paid to think of their ideas rather than give them 6 weeks to produce an idea and a partnership. So that's, it's not totally gelling, but it's, we've got some very exciting propositions in. Beatrice, how do you think you can, how do you think we can bring these partners together? Because if John's right, that at the stage we're at the moment, which is probably fine for our first expressions of interest, but we have to go towards developing challenges. How do we get people together, do you think?
Yeah, identifying the problem is always difficult. And I think some of the challenges are perhaps written into the bid. I mean, a lot of the challenges that I see smaller companies dealing with is about finding room for experimentation while also making a living. And perhaps, these are big budgets this time you have very measurable outcomes required. So how are the people that take part going to be able to evidence that whilst really pushing the boundary and doing some proper R&D? How do we bring them together around a shared interest, I would say, and facilitated really carefully? You can put lots of interesting people in a room and nothing can come out of it, particularly when they all speak different kinds of languages and have slightly different agendas. So, I mean, from my point of view, I would be really interested to see some challenges that took in something like the one that you just spoke about, but perhaps were more purpose-led in terms of how do we make the world a bit better, or how do we deal with some of the big, wicked problems that we're all dealing with today. And that may not be what the AHRC is looking for primarily, but it might be one way to kind of drive a set of disparate parties together with a kind of higher purpose.
I think that's a really interesting idea if people were to take that approach, but probably you're also pointing out that actually it just takes work. So actually bringing people together is, if we want this outcome, then perhaps we should be encouraging bidders to work on that rather than...
I think there's an art in curation and an art in getting those people to work together. But I must also mention, before we go on, the sort of beauty and the inspiration and the potential of bringing in some international thinking into this mix as well. And that's not just about selling this outwards, this is about learning from, identifying, building on the brilliant ideas that are out there in many unusual places that can offer inspiration, but also new markets for a lot of the people here. And obviously, as a British Council, that's something that we would like to support this programme.
So great, so that's an offer of coming on as a partner.
Sure.
To channel that information from around your network around the world into this programme.
For sure.
Fabulous.
And that global thing seems to me really, really crucial, that this whole economy is so global, not to be thinking globally. I mean, obviously the benefits have got to accrue to the UK, but not to be thinking globally and internationally would be a real mistake.
Okay, I was going to ask each of you if there was one thing that came out of this programme that you'd like to see, with absolutely no onus, no responsibility to deliver it in any way. Starting with you, John, what would it be?
I think it would be a greater recognition that the range of markets that's now available is vastly greater than anybody suspects, if you like. And as a really simple little example of that, I was at a dinner in Oxford with the guy who runs the biochemistry department in the university, who was saying we got onto the games industry, and he was saying he's looking around for good digital artists and coders because data visualization is increasingly an issue for the biochemists. And he said, and I can't source any of that in the biochemistry department, and I can't find where these people are. I'm sure they're knocking around, but I don't know how to locate them. I mean, it's a kind of classic example of where the thinking of the creative industries and methodology and skills can bring all kinds of insights to other sectors of the economy. And if that was a really significant driver in this, then it seems to me it would also be something that transforms the UK economy. And I think one of the interesting things that Greg Clark said in the launch of the Bazalgette Review was he emphasised yet again, I think quite surprisingly for a government minister, it's where creative ideas and technology crash into each other that the really interesting stuff happens, and there isn't enough of that kind of crossover, and if that's what came out of this programme, it would be sensational.
One thing you'd like? Apart from the solution to the entire film grammar.
Well, I've got a slightly odd thing. You described in your intro that we've become a university. We're not a university. We've become a higher education institution.
Sorry, yeah.
And I have a thing
I'm not
about,
a professional.
It's interesting. I have a thing about universities at the moment is that they're kind of not in vogue. That degree apprenticeships put universities on the edge. Tuition fees and vice-chancellors' pay put universities in a difficult position. I think it would be really interesting in 4 or 5 years' time to have real concrete examples of how universities have supported business and worked with business to do something they couldn't have done on their own. And I think universities have got to grab that, because I think if they mess it up on this one, as John McVeigh said, it may not come around again.
Yeah.
And it's not what universities typically have done. And so it requires different thinking from universities. But I believe in universities, so I really want them to do that.
Okay, that's quite a good challenge, actually. It's because it's a clear objective, but it is a challenge. So it was a prize to see.
But I think it would be great to see.
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I'm not. I think that would be, if that was an outcome. Just as the one that John's described of the impact of across the wider economy of creative practice. I think they would be both very good outcomes. B, have you got a third one?
And aside from the international, I suppose I would just go for something that was really imaginative. This is a creative R&D fund, as you said. It's the first time that we've ever had this scale, which is fantastic. Let's show the other industries what this industry does that no other does, and that's to imagine new possibilities and new worlds. So if there isn't something in there that's really kind of, out there, that would be a real shame, I think.
Yeah, so I think that's more of a challenge to us as an organisation than it is to the bids that are coming in. Is how do we, if we have that ambition, how do we follow through on it?
The ones that you that you choose.
Because
or at least one of them, you should feel very uncomfortable about it not working.
Yeah. or actually pleased about it not working. I suppose it's that. Yeah. So it's that trying to position ourselves that we encourage the radical and the risky. And then the only problem is then backing it up with confidence and not killing it through the evaluation process.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe one other, I suppose, if this is about economic growth, like how can that growth be as inclusive as possible?
Yeah.
So there are unlikely partners involved in that, which aren't just the ones that perhaps would usually get AHRC or similar kind of funding.
And when you say inclusive, what do you mean? Because we know that the inclusivity is a challenge within the creative industries, within some of our creative industries at the moment. Are you thinking along gender and ethnicity lines, or are you thinking more
all
broadly
lines.
than that?
Class as well is really important. Ways of thinking, different kinds. There's a
how things
huge,
are made, the ethics and the kind of working practices of that, not just what the outcome is.
But there are pockets of brilliance all over the country, and so it's just about surfacing them. And I think that's what, the brilliant thing about this brief is that it's allowing for unlikely allies or different kinds of collaborations to work. But some people don't have the access to those opportunities usually and can be brought in at this stage.
And John, can I ask you to set this in the context of what a sector deal might do, or as Baz indicated, into a kind of wider vision? We've got a defined amount of funding to do a defined bit of this architecture. Where do you think, if we can show this works, where do you think that can go in terms of expanding the kind of clusters approach to address some of those other issues?
Well, I think there's the bigger or different cluster program proposed as part of the Creative Industries Council. I think
cluster program. I like
proper cluster program. Yeah. I think there's quite a lot of skepticism about, or a lot of lip service paid to the idea that universities are a crucial part, or higher education thinking is a crucial part of the future of the creative economy and creative industries. But actually, when it comes down to it, there's quite a lot of skepticism of what that means and what that looks like on the ground. And if out of this came some really substantial practical issues, the kind you were talking about, John, that would be a huge win, because I think it would make people embrace it's Rory's point, find the name, create the environment, people begin to understand it. And I think there's still skepticism there, and there's still some way to go in saying this really is. I mean, it's the old thing, the universities are the coal mines of the 21st century. They're the kind of key drivers of the future of the economy. People will pay lip service to that, but they're not quite convinced about it. So I think establishing some practical partnerships that deliver real outcomes in the next 3 or 4 years from this program would be a fantastic game changer.
Okay.
And the other cluster program is not going to do that, because that's not what it's about.
No. Okay. So that's really clear. Okay. I think the panel. What I take from this panel is a series of challenges. So challenges to the university sector to grasp this prize of business engagement in this sector, to make a proof point around this, disprove some of this skepticism around it, and then I think Beatrice's challenge to us as an organisation and to the whole process that we're trying to get to be able to embrace the radical and different and slightly out there is what I've taken from this panel. So I'd just like to thank the panel, and that concludes the morning session. And thank you. Oh.